Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I think a lot of people are concerned about Canada's place in the world today, and I've had a couple of shows on Canadian irrelevance and Canadian foreign affairs and Canadian military affairs, what we should be doing in the Middle East, what we should be doing in Ukraine, what we should be doing in the Arctic. And I read a really interesting piece just last week by David McKinnon. And I wanted to reach out to him and understand better what his thesis was. David McKinnon is a former Canadian diplomat. He's been posted to New Delhi, Canberra, Bangkok, and most recently Colombia, where he served as Canada's High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and the Maldives from 2017 to 2022. We might go into a little bit more of his depth of experience and the roles he's played for us as Canadians worldwide. But I wanted to just jump right into it. David, welcome to the show. Tell me if you could, you used the language that we have an exorbitant privilege. Canada does. Yeah. What did you mean by Canada has had an exorbitant privilege?
Well, that's and I'm being, a bit lyrical about that, but it's a term that actually dates back to, it was a French criticism of the unparalleled position of the United States in the global financial system and of the US dollar in the global financial system after World War II. And they famously described it as the Americans' exorbitant privilege. Basically, they could do what they wanted and didn't worry too much about it. In our case, I'm talking about exorbitant privilege. I'm talking about our geography and history, which is highly favorable. And although we have had at one time or another innovative and forward-thinking leadership, this unusual geography and history has brought us prosperity and security with relatively little effort since 1945. The geography brought us resource wealth and isolation from active conflict. And it also brought us immediate proximity to the richest and most powerful country in the world, which, at least as far as we were concerned, was a very benevolent player, an important democracy.
Hope it continues to be that way.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and you're anticipating a little where I'm going on this. But I think that also even our success, which is notable and we can be proud of, in recent decades of developing a remarkably diverse society, reflects to a considerable degree this advantageous alignment. It allows us to assert, if you will, our Canadianness without thinking too much about the commitments that entailed and what enabled us to get to this point, and importantly, the hard work we need to be doing to preserve it. So in that sense, I think we've come, as the world has changed, we've come to the end of that exorbitant privilege. Decades of living off our geography and history and the trust we built up internationally through outsized contributions in the 20th century. I mean, those were in another century, and so that the memory of those outsized contributions has ended, and the world is now really fragmented. But it's also highly connected, and our location is not as unambiguously a positive as maybe it once was. And proximity to the U.S. It could soon pose a lot more risks than I think certainly we could have imagined 20 years ago. And those risks could even in some ways exceed the benefits. So also threats to our sovereignty are increasing as
threats to our sovereignty?
Well, yeah, to our sovereignty and our security are increasing because you look at the North, and with the opening up of with climate change, and also with the aggressiveness of powers like the assertiveness, I should say, of powers like Russia and China, we need to be thinking about how we preserve that sovereignty and that security. So these assertive powers are challenging the international order as we have enjoyed it for decades, and it's an international order they don't see as in their interests, and they often see us as a weak link in that international order. So we really need to be thinking about how we do our bit, both for domestic reasons and international reasons.
2 weeks ago, I interviewed former General Rick Hillier, and he said that Canada in foreign relations had become irrelevant. Are we irrelevant today?
Well, having spent my career in Canada's foreign relations, I hesitate to say completely that we're irrelevant, or I'd wonder about my contribution to that. But being more serious, I do think that we have marginalized ourselves. And I could see earlier in my career where we were a much more serious player, even on things like trade policy. I mean, I started off my career on the trade side of the organization, although I worked across the board on issues. But we were seen as a sort of thoughtful, innovative player in the 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, with free trade with the US. We were a key player in the Uruguay round of created the World Trade Organization, this kind of thing. And I think, yeah, I think we've lost that drive or that vision that and that understanding that made us interesting to others. But I also think it's this thing about history passing, that we ran down a lot of our capacity, but we could rely on people. There was a generation of people who understood what we had done in terms of major commitments on the world stage, outsized commitments for our size. But we're now past that, and I'm now out of my I've now finished my foreign service career, and it was really a generation before me that remembered that contribution well. So we have to be realistic.
So why has that happened? My grandfather was wounded at Vimy Ridge, and I think in World War I and World War II we played a sizable role. We were all proud when Lester B. Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize, and the role that we played in the Suez, and we were proud of the blue helmet and the role we played in peacekeeping around the world. We were proud of Romeo Dallaire and the issues he raised in Africa, even though we were in Africa as a peacekeeper. We thought we played an important role. We were proud to wear the Canadian flag on our backpack as we hiked through Europe. Why is all that gone?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is, maybe my great grandfather treated your grandfather at Vimy Ridge at the field station, because he was a doctor in the Canadian Medical Corps there. And I have an uncle buried in Flanders, and and in fact, I'm married to an Australian who's got family also. I mean, we're well aware of those commitments and what went on through the 20th century. But I think we mistook our good fortune for somehow our brilliance, and that
hold it. Please repeat that.
We mistook our good fortune, our privilege of our geography and our history, for somehow innate brilliance when it came to engaging with the world.
So we were lucky.
This myth about the world,
we thought we were brilliant.
Sorry?
We were lucky and we thought we were brilliant.
Brilliant. That's a good way to put it. That's a more succinct way to put it. And the whole thing, exorbitant privilege in a way is is a different way of saying the old comment about Canadians are born on third base and think they're brilliant ball players. And or think they hit the triple to get there. So, and I think that's something we need to really reflect on. And at one time or another, we have, stood up and done what was necessary. I mean, the contributions that we made in the past were, a lot of blood and toil, blood and tears, but we can't in the modern world just get by being nicer than everybody else. We have to understand and talk about what our interests are, who we are, what do we value as a country. And I think that's the piece that's been missing. We've kind of gone around and asserted, aren't we brilliant? We've got this wonderful, prosperous society. Everybody loves each other. And we go around and like to think that somehow we got everything right on that, rather than being a bit more modest and understanding both what we got right, but also what we were given. And I've seen it, out in the field. People aren't looking for the Canadians to come and show up and tell them how to run their lives, and that they're so great. And we have to be careful about this. And we do have a good story to tell, but we also, stories are much more attractive when they're told more modestly than than they are about telling someone we've got all the answers.
We're chatting tonight with David McKinnon. He is a long-term Foreign Service individual. We're going to talk a little bit about some of his background in a couple of minutes, but he's making the argument that Canada in the past has had exorbitant privilege, as if we've been born on third base, that we've had luck in our location, in our resources, in our friends, in our neighbors, etc., and that all of that is at risk today. And I think this is an issue we really need to think about and contemplate as we think about a bunch of the issues that are facing our country in the future in regards to climate change, in regards to our resources that seem so often at odds to each other, in regards to our commitment to defense spending and military spending, where NATO has a commitment that we spend 2% of our GDP on defense spending, and we're at war right now, or at least it appears that the West is at war with a renewed autocrat that's comparable to what happened in World War II, and should we play a far larger role in what's going on in Europe? And some people talking about, is this the start of a new Cold War? Is this the start of a new World War III? Is this the start of whatever? Given that we've got obviously this the Russian invasion of Ukraine in Eastern Europe, we've got strife in the Middle East, and we've got issues in the Pacific between China and Taiwan that thankfully hasn't bubbled into war as of yet. But again, is that because we're brilliant or because we're lucky so far? And so I think that David McKinnon raises some really big, important issues that we got to confront and think about. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with David McKinnon, a Foreign Service international relations expert, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with David McKinnon. He is a really interesting gentleman. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his career in a second. And we're talking about really whether Canada has an important role in the world today. David's made an argument that we have in the past had something he calls exorbitant privilege, that really, he described it well when he said that Canadians are born on third base and feel like they've hit a triple, or we're lucky and we think we're brilliant. And are we playing the role in the world today that we have in the past and that we want to play, given that we, according to General Rick Hillier a week ago when I interviewed, said we're irrelevant, where, I've interviewed people talking about our security and said that, the reality is the Russians could be on Canadian landmass or whatever already. We just don't even only have the military or the abilities right now to know whether they're in our Arctic, and we've got this huge Arctic that we're not defending, and that the Americans just don't see that we're playing the role that we could and should. And I've heard that there's organizations, I don't even know what they're called, but the Four Eyes or something like that, or the Five Eyes, where we're not even being included in those intelligence organizations anymore. Anyway, we got David McKinnon, who's an expert in this regard, to talk to us. David has got a BA in history from the University of Toronto. He's got an MBA from Queen's University, and he's spent 35 years in the Canadian Foreign Service. He served in multiple different positions related to the range of Canadians' overseas trade, economic, and diplomatic interest, with a strong focus in what we now call the Indo-Pacific. He was Canada's High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and the Maldives from 2017 to 2022. Previously, he had served in Bangkok, Canberra twice, including as deputy head of the mission, and New Delhi, where he headed Canada's commercial program in India and Nepal. In Ottawa, his most recent position was the Director General responsible for managing Canada's diplomatic properties at 175 missions around the world. Since leaving the Foreign Service 2 years ago, he has been enjoying life in Ottawa and offering independent advice on Canada's place in the world. He is a research associate at the University of Ottawa Centres for International Policy Studies, and on the board member of AMB Canada, the Canadian Ambassadors Alumni Association, and the New Edinburgh Heritage and Development Committee. 35 years in the Foreign Service. That's pretty impressive, sir.
Yeah, it wasn't totally what it was not planned, but it was sort of serendipitously happened, and I got into the Foreign Service, and then at the age of 24 found myself in Bangkok helping Canadian companies in what was then the world's fastest growing economy, which people forget. And that was my first glimpse that the world is changing out there. A lot of our assumptions about the world that we have back in Canada, about the developed world versus the developing world, about the West versus the rest, were maybe up for question. And so, yeah, it was, and I ended up spending 21 of my 35 years in the Foreign Service abroad in what we now call the Indo-Pacific. I was the Indo-Pacific guy before there was the term. Yeah, it was a rewarding career, fantastic opportunity to work with great people. And Canada, people do look, I would, I also served, as you mentioned, in other places. I would take a little bit of, I would differ a little bit with Rick Hillier, in that I think he's right on the military side of things, and he's much better placed to speak to that than I am. But I think Canada still has a relevance, but a lot of it is about the power of our example. It's not about telling other people how to run their lives or this sort of thing, but it's about making sure that our own society, which has worked well until today, continues to work well, continues to show that a diverse, pluralistic society can be prosperous and welcoming. I think there's a whole raft of positives there that we can talk about, but we need to understand that that doesn't come without work, and we need to be very clear talking to each other. We need to, Houston, we have a problem. We need to acknowledge that there's some issues we have to deal with, and we can't do that without talking to each other.
Okay, so we want to get to what we should be doing in a minute, but let's talk about how we got here. And you've talked about this exorbitant privilege and this luck, but we did have a role historically that we've just chatted about in regards to World War II, Vimy Ridge, peacekeeping, etc. Why have we lost that? Because of lack of spending, because of wearing costumes when we're traveling abroad? What has it been that has lost our place in the world?
Well, I think that it's a combination of things. I think we did, circumstance led us, and we saw the clear need because of our role and connection to Britain, particularly, to be very supportive in the First and Second World Wars and make that major commitment. I think that we then found, it went on in Korea. I mean, we were a big contributor in Korea too, to the conflict there in the 1950s, and we continued. Through the 80s, we had troops in Europe. We saw that we were a partner in the post-war order, and then I think after the Berlin Wall fell, as I think about this, we took too literally that maybe this was the end of history. As I think it was Francis Fukuyama famously wrote a paper with that title. And we suddenly thought that we could start to coast, that security didn't matter so much, foreign affairs secondary to domestic interests. We didn't want to have a conversation with Canadians about what is our place in the world, but also if you want all the things that government can deliver to you, we have to find a way to have the prosperity to pay for it. And I think that there was a willingness to run down our military expenditure and foreign affairs and other things so that we could fund commitments that had a more immediate resonance domestically. I think that's a lot of what went on. So in the 1990s, program review, which was hugely important in terms of balancing the budget, and don't get me wrong, it was very important to take those steps under the Chrétien-Martin era. But we didn't, once we balanced the budget, then rebuild those capacities that we should have. Instead, we just moved on. There's a bit of a blip in Afghanistan. We put money into it, but we really ran down. This is a long-term thing. It's not just about one party or one person. It went on for quite a while. And so I think that's a lot of the challenge. And Canadians have the sense that they know the world because they, the joke used to be you could always, see what was going on and, Buffalo, and flip on your TV in Toronto and see what was going on in Buffalo. And so therefore you understood a bit of the world. And that's a dangerous assumption to make. And so I think those are the pieces that played into this. We also, I think, and this is the politics of it, that we did a fantastic job, really, of widening our immigration, opening up to people from around the world. So Canada started to look more like the world. But we made a mistake of thinking that meant we understood the world. And that somehow, because we had these people who traced their origins around the world, that we didn't need to, perhaps we could just assume that we understood it, and diasporas play an extremely important role in Canadian society and part of our dialogue about our place in the world. But we have to be realistic about whether they actually explain the world to us, or are they part of the conversation? We, as officials, opinion leaders, politicians, need to actually understand the world ourselves and be able to situate those perspectives into a more thoroughgoing curiosity and interest about the world.
Let me ask you a question about leadership, though, if I could. Clearly what you're mentioning is lack of investment, lack of dollars in military and other ways.
Lack of curiosity, I think, too.
Lack of curiosity. Well, that's interesting. So 10 days ago, many of us were watching the funeral of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and we were reminded, I think, in great detail about the role he played internationally. The guts that it took, the political capital that it took to negotiate, number one, a free trade agreement with the United States, but then also things about acid rain, apartheid, etc. That he was very involved in several different major international activities, and I think that Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the first Trudeau, had a similar kind of stature worldwide. Has Canada had prime ministers, leaders that have played that kind of, have had that stature worldwide since Mulroney?
I don't think so. I think that's the real challenge, and I think that what stood Brian Mulroney out was the willingness to, on certain things, shift course and do what he came to understand was important for the future of the country. Free trade is a good example of that. Tax reform, the GST, which people love to hate, but frankly was crucial in terms of the balancing of the budget and managing our finances properly. He was willing, for whatever reason. I didn't know him. But he was someone who could see. He was a fantastic retail politician, and that's well known. But he also had an ability to see beyond, in certain cases, beyond the immediate and beyond the transactional. And I think our challenge now is that a combination of technology and the way that our political system works, we are highly transactional. So, in the current conflict in the Middle East, rather than there being sort of some thoughtful consideration about, well, what should Canada's response be, first off, to the, horrible attacks on the 7th of October, but then what should our response be to a country that we've at one time considered ourselves close to is maybe behaving in a way that we don't see as appropriate in conflict. And we've had a long history of talking about this. But instead, we see all this, the image comes across that these things are seen through the lens of, well, what's the vote? Who's going to vote for us based on the positions we take on specific issues? And we've seen this in other countries as well. And that's, I think, the piece that challenges us now. And under Mulroney, for whatever reason, and his interest in apartheid was fascinating because it wasn't a place that he had any connection to, as far as I know, but felt strongly that this was the right thing to do. Went up against Maggie Thatcher and others on this, impressively. But also his willingness to pursue this stuff didn't play out very well at the ballot box in 1993, as we know. So
But is that the
leadership
test of a prime minister? Is that the test of a leader? Being popular and winning the ballot box? I guess you need to do it for a while, but isn't it better to be remembered by history of doing the right thing?
Well, I guess you can't be prime minister if you don't win at the ballot box to begin with. But once you're there, you need to be willing to do things that are maybe not what the pollsters tell you are the most popular, or you need to talk to people. You need to be willing to ask people, whether experts or the population at large, put out questions that you don't necessarily know the answer to. And I think the challenge in our current environment is that communications is all set up about having knowing what the answer is going to be, or telling a story, not about talking to people. I mean, the fact that, I hear this from friends who are journalists and in the comms area, that, now media staff never actually talk to journalists anymore. They just send them a preset email. There's no sort of engagement there. And I think that's the piece that we're missing in this, is going out and talking to Canadians. And in that piece I wrote for the Center for International Policy Studies about exorbitant privilege, I talked about the 1980s McDonald Commission, which was set up under Pierre Trudeau. It was called formerly the Royal Commission on the Economic Union and Development Prospects for Canada. And he set it up in 1982 at a time of enormous economic challenge and time of change. I mean, the country was in a pretty serious crisis at the time. And he set this up as a very public engagement on the future of Canada, of the economic side of things. And that was a 2 or 3 year process. The report came out in 1985. And I remember, I was a student at the time, and I remember how much that drove public discussion. And there was a lot of conversation in the media, among business, among civil society, about what it was doing, about potential policy options, and that Canada had at a crossroads. And, the report comes out, and people in recent weeks have been remembering that it laid the groundwork for Brian Mulroney as Prime Minister to undertake, major lasting reforms, including on free trade with the US, which they had actually opposed in the 1984 election. But this gave them an intellectual framework to wrap their heads around and think about the future of the country. And so that to me suggests that Brian Mulroney, adept as he was as a politician, didn't think he had all the answers, that he was looking for answers to problems that he had to come to grips with once he got into power. And that's an important piece of this. And that's what I think we need to find a way back to, having some kind of common public square where we can talk to each other without malice, without without fear that differing views are going to be, seen as the devil incarnate, or however you want to put it, but that where we can talk openly about what the challenges are that the country faces and what the policy options are that we have out there to take ourselves forward. And that could be on the economy, it should be on foreign policy, but also on defense and security.
I think there was another thing, though, that happened there. You talked about the McDonald Royal Commission. There were 26 volumes that were part of that McDonald Royal Commission. There were, sessions, public sessions across the country discussing it. Yeah. But then he fought an election on it. And there was that famous debate between him and John Turner, where they were arguing about the benefits of free trade. And Turner was effectively saying, you're selling out the country. And I think it came down to Mulroney had the courage to use his political capital for what he thought was right. And I worry that too many politicians don't. it's that line that I think Sade used about what's the benefit of having political capital if you're not willing to use it for what you think is right. And it contrasts fairly dramatically with Kim Campbell, who I think famously said election's not the time to talk about policy, which I disagreed with completely. And I think that the fact that we actually fought an election over free trade and it won, I think was amazing. Excuse me, I had the opportunity to sit down very quickly with Brian Mulroney at a wedding that I was at that he was also at, and he was alone, sitting off in a corner. And I went over and chatted with him, and I asked him about his career. And you won't be surprised, he said the things he was proudest about were free trade and the GST, and one that was reasonably popular and one that was incredibly unpopular. And he said that he thought the GST would be the smartest thing that was ever done, and he thought that Harper's reduction of the GST, albeit incredibly popular, was one of the dumbest policy decisions of all time. And that's the proof of things, that sometimes politicians, leaders, have to make unpopular decisions that they think are right. And doing the popular thing may actually be not smart.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And I'd add, that those changes that we made in free trade and in the GST. And I mean, we have to say also, there was an awful lot in the Royal Commission that for political reasons didn't get acted on, including Senate reform. And I think there's stuff about interprovincial trade and this kind of thing. So it wasn't that there wasn't some politics in how it was implemented. But, in my experience, and certainly, when I served for the first time in Australia in the 1990s, and I was doing primarily trade policy work there after, curiously, secondment to their foreign ministry, Canada was very well respected and the Australians are, if you know any Australians, they're quite happy to offer their views if they don't agree with you. So, but they were impressed you could tell by the fact that Canada had managed to do this deal with the US, how we had met with the track we'd managed to put our relationship with the US on. That GST, in fact, they followed a few years later with the GST because they saw how successful it had been in Canada. And there was a public debate. Now, I think the difference in Australia, they actually fought an election on where the GST was an issue, and the government won. But there they actually had a robust public discussion about the benefits of it or otherwise. And this is the piece where I think that we need to spend more time talking to each other. It's not just about experts and about politicians level, the provinces are part of this conversation too, but it's being open and saying, we're the leadership. We don't have all the answers. We're actually out here to talk to people and find out what's on your mind. We did this Indo-Pacific strategy, which actually is quite good in many ways, but there was an unwillingness to go out and talk to people about this. So I fear that it won't last, after a next election. Where will it go? And I contrast this with, when I last served in Australia, and the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard put out commissioned this Australia in the Asian Century white paper, and it was a policy paper that was intended to look at all, what does the rise of Asia mean for Australia? What does Australia need to do to take advantage of this to be secure and prosperous? And that white paper, they sent teams out across the country. There were senior people involved in it talking. They had hearings. They had input. It was quite an ambitious, in certain ways, an impressive document. Now, it didn't, as the Asian Century White Paper, didn't survive the change of government after her when Tony Abbott became prime minister, but key elements of it did, because there'd been a sensitization, there'd been a discussion out there about and the body politic was familiar with these issues, and therefore there was an open door to pursuing the policy ideas that made sense. Whereas if a government holds too close to its chest policy development, I worry that it doesn't bring along the other quiet allies who may not be of their party, but actually see that some of this makes sense, and therefore will not, radically change course once they come into office. It's finding that bipartisan more common, what are the common elements of our foreign policy and our defense policy that we can get some quiet agreement across parties, and we don't have, as notoriously we've had in the past, parties come in and cancel major procurement projects from the previous one, which is hugely expensive. We see that at the provincial level in Ontario, canceling transit projects at one time or another, this kind of stuff. That kind of thing is very, very, very expensive. And instead, we should be having more of a conversation to try, and I'm not Pollyannish about politics. I know how divisive it can be, but I also think that just getting out there, a leader who's willing to talk to people that don't agree with him or her is a huge start.
David McKinnon, what a radical idea in a democracy. Actually talking to people and listening, getting out there and talking to people. It sounds like you actually believe that the people should be heard. It was amazing. I went to Les Miserables this past weekend, and that's what it's all about. Let the people say. We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes with David McKinnon, a foreign affairs expert, talking about where Canada is in the world today. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is David McKinnon. He is a former Canadian diplomat. He's been in the Foreign Service of Canada for 35 years. He's worked in New Delhi, Canberra, Bangkok, and most recently Colombo. Sorry, I apologize. Where he served as Canada's High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. I've got to ask you about the Maldives. I've always wanted to go. And we've been talking about a term that he's described as Canada's exorbitant privilege, and it's best described by we've had some luck and we think we're brilliant, or I love this analogy used that we were born on third base and we thought we had hit a great triple and we were running for home. We talked about what has changed and things and I think that's been interesting. But then you talk about this encouraging constructive discussion and a cross-party sense of the national interest. And you said you're not Pollyannish. You actually think that's possible. So, in today's world where, and I'll give you an example, carbon taxes, where I think the vast majority, if not almost all economists believe that putting a price on carbon is the right way to do it. And frankly, it was conservative parties that were the parties that first recommended carbon taxes because it was the market that were making decisions rather than government red tape and regulation that was trying to restrict carbon use. And yet it is, like the GST, a probably difficult concept to explain and sell. And right now, axe the tax seems to be the more successful route. So how do you build this national interest, this cross-party collaboration and consensus?
Well, very good question. And I think one of the things and then I'll get into more practically what I'm talking about, but you don't start by vilifying people who have a different view from yours simply because they have a different view from yours. And you need to and you need to go out with a genuinely curious mind and talk to anybody who's got a relevant position, that a relevant perspective, and then come to your own conclusion. And in this case, I think well, back this up. I mean, if I only in my career when I was serving abroad representing Canada, and I think particularly that's the case in Sri Lanka, where I was the head of mission, but even elsewhere, that if I only ever went out and talked to people who agreed with what Canada's position was to begin with on something, I would never develop the insights that I needed to be able to either advocate that position for Canada or advocate a modification of it to reflect local realities. And instead, in our current media environment, and the approach to comms is very much about talking to people that you kind of know what they're going to say, and you select the groups. And I think we have to realize how bad that is. I mean, I remember doing media training years ago, and the thing always was, oh, if you don't like the question, answer a different one. That, answer the one you want to answer. And that's, I get that, but at the same time, people start to get pissed off if you're not answering the question that they posed to you, and maybe you need to answer the question and then flip it over to where you want to emphasize. But I think what we could do now is, and this is taking a leaf out of the McDonald Commission, and we have a long history that going back where we used to do foreign policy white papers, policy papers on foreign policy, on defense, royal commissions on crucial issues that we wanted to put above politics at some level, and be open to talking to people who didn't have necessarily the same view as we do, that go out and develop through talking to experts or talking simply to other interested members of the community, seeking input where you may suddenly find that there are people you're not talking to who've got a very relevant perspective that you want to integrate. And so I've suggested that, the current government look, and maybe the Prime Minister could take a leaf out of his father's book, because it would need his support, but he'd ideally also have cross-party buy-in, some buy-in, is to establish another Royal Commission, or whatever we want to call it, to look particularly at the economy, but also you could do ones that look at foreign policy and defense and security, with a view to having a process that delivers a result probably after the next election, so that it'll be on the table for whoever's the new leader to take a look at, and put that challenge out there to the other members of politics and say, yeah, when you're in opposition, the answers look easy, but let's talk about the complex challenges Canada faces, and let's try to have a conversation where we're at least dealing with some common understanding. Again, call me Pollyanna, but I do think that and I speak from my own experience, that people can have deeply held and antagonistic views towards your own. But if in the right circumstances you reach out to them and have a conversation, it's rare the person who in person isn't willing to actually have a serious conversation.
But David, how can you have that conversation when you go out into the community and people are throwing stones at you, or you want to have a meeting with the Italian diaspora with the Prime Minister of Italy, and there's protests that don't even allow the session to occur, and you can't even interact with people. We're living in an echo chamber world today, where people are only listening to the media that are already spouting what they believe, and we're only hearing what we want to hear. I saw an interview with Lloyd Robertson, who talked about the change in news, that news used to be factual, and it was, expressing a common set of facts for everyone, where today all you do is you put a whole bunch of people on to discuss their opinion on one set of the political spectrum, either right or left or far left or far right. And you take a look at True Social, which has been in the news of late. All it is a copy of Twitter for the right, and it's valued at outrageous valuations, because too many right-wing people are only on it today.
Even if it's losing money. Well, yeah, and no, I hear you, and that's why I'm thinking you need to be bold in terms of going out there and saying, well, I am willing to hear from people. You can't obviously put the Prime Minister and others in any kind of, I'm not suggesting the Prime Minister goes out and does this himself, but commission a thoughtful, cross-partisan, or whatever you want to say, diverse viewpoint group to go and run this sort of thing. Seek input, and people can input electronically now, and then you can invite people who've got clearly something more to say to come and talk to you. You can do it that way, but I also think we need to have really zero tolerance for intimidatory behavior. That and we need to be thinking about this, and we need to be clear among ourselves. Well, is it acceptable in society to have the sorts of violent demonstrations? What's the line that we're not willing to cross? And we need to have a conversation about that. And it doesn't matter whether someone's underlying viewpoint is one we have sympathy with. If they're in a democracy, you can't have voices being shut down for people trying to shut down others through aggressive behavior. And we need to be thinking about what are the limits, and we talk about that in society, and we say, okay, it's not appropriate for the kinds of things we've seen in the streets of Toronto and in other cities. It's not acceptable for violence or anything else to take place. But that's again we have to be clear about that. We've got to be clear that it's not about the immediate votes. It's about, well, we're in a democracy, and what we value in this democracy is that people are respectful and are enabled to have differing views, but that they do it in a way that is respectful of others, so that they can have their own views heard.
You spent a fair amount of time in India.
Mm.
And you wrote an article in the Globe and Mail about the Indian debacle should prompt Canada to rethink the naive way we engage with the world.
Yeah.
Naive way? Tell me about it.
Well, it's touching a little bit about what I mentioned earlier, and that I get into in there, which is that we, even as India was rising, our understanding of it was not evolving. There was a time actually where we had a very strong, unusually strong relationship with India. Back in the 50s, there was if you go back into history, there was a personal relationship between Louis Saint Laurent and Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first prime minister of independent India. And we didn't sort of evolve beyond that. And I think that we continued to make assumptions about the world, and we saw the world through a domestic lens. And on the India case, we saw it through, we had an easy story to tell about people-to-people links and shared values of democracy and human rights, and et cetera, et cetera. And those photo ops that politicians loved when they came to India only told a part of the story. And the story was that India is, first off, it's 20% of humanity. So what happens there matters to us more than just immediate votes. But it's also that we need to understand it in its own right, not through simply local politics. And that was and for that reason, that in India we didn't, in my view, and I wrote this in the aftermath of this terrible killing of Mr. Nijjar in Vancouver, but that we didn't develop a well-rounded understanding of either India today or what drives the Indians. We never heard their security concerns, any of this sort of thing. They started to see us as irrelevant because we weren't offering anything beyond photo ops in the relationship. Whereas a lot of our partners, including, you mentioned the Five Eyes, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US and UK, developed much wider ranging relationships with India. So there was, the Indians sort of respected them in a different way than to us, whereas the Canadians, I think they felt we didn't really have a good sense of what India was and what drives India and India's importance. They're very convinced of their own importance, and it's hard to deny that they are important when they are, the world's largest country now. So that's what I was getting at, is that we took too many assumptions based on either our history or our politics that didn't really help with a well-rounded understanding of the country. And just as a sort of background to this, I mean, I remember when I mentioned about going to Thailand, and fastest growing economy in the world. In the 3 years I was there, double-digit growth every year. Per capita GDP grew by more than a third in years I was there. I mean,
more than a third.
More than a third in 3 years. And yet I come back to Ottawa, and there's still this mindset, particularly within our development seat at the time, but elsewhere, that the outside of the West, the poverty is getting worse, and that's all a bad story, and Canada needs to up it. It's only Canada's help that's going to get, improve things in these places. And I remember, and I was at a gathering where someone was articulating this view, and I said, I just came back from a place that's actually solving its challenges largely on its, not only on its own, but it's finding a way forward to improve the lot of its people. And we can't rely on our old assumptions. And it's a bit like India. Ultimately, it is raising people out of poverty, but it's a much more complicated politically place, I think, than fits what our traditional view has been of it. And that's a piece that we need to get our heads around. We can't just engage with countries we like or that we think have similar values to ours. We need to, realize that countries are important because we have interests with those countries. You talk to Saskatchewan, they're a huge exporter to India. They're the largest, I think, continually one of the biggest exporters among all our provinces to India because of the pulses and now uranium and wheat and, all this sort of stuff. And that's the conversation we also need to be having. It's not, we have interests and we need to think about those, and we need to then recognize our values and how we pursue those interests. That's the piece.
We're chatting tonight with David McKinnon. He's a 35-year foreign service expert in Canada. He's been representing us around the world, and he's recently written a fascinating piece about Canada's role in the world, or lack thereof, and that this exorbitant privilege that we've enjoyed with natural resources, being 3 oceans separated from the rest of the world, other than the United States, our largest trading partner, which has been for most of our history, obviously, other than during the Civil War,
and the War of 1812.
And the War of 1812, a good neighbor. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
Okay. Well, I would say...
Hold it. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got these incredibly smart people that always want to interrupt me. I can't believe it. David, do you have a final comment before we go?
Well, I think that business as usual won't cut it. And we need to realize how much things have changed. And I think we need to realize Canadians understand at a certain level things have changed, but we need to talk about what those changes are and help them understand them and help develop support for making our own, making the reforms and new approaches that we need to take advantage of this world and ensure, prosperity continues for us.
I've got 3 final comments. Number 1, listening. I went in the 1970s to a session with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, where he listened to people from across the country all day long. And then the end of it, after listening for probably 3/4 of the day, he went around the room, summarized what everyone else had said, and came forward with his strategy. I think that we need leaders that are willing to listen to people today. Number 2, I think it is there's no use in having political capital if you're not going to use it, and so therefore we need people that are going to go out and use their positions to lead in the world. Nikki Haley, who was a candidate for the Republican primary presidential, talked about no one is out there talking about how critically important Ukraine is, and I think that's right, that we sort of assume people know that rather than going out and actually persuading and talking and discussing and leading. And then I think number 3, I love David McKinnon's comment about that we're Canadians, we feel like we're brilliant, even though we're really just lucky. And so therefore, I think we got to admit our current situation. We got to pay our way in NATO. We got to arm our armed forces. We've got to protect our sovereignty in the Arctic. And I think we've got history watching us in regards to how we arm, defend, support Ukraine. And I think that that's really critical in our world today. David McKinnon, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. That's our show tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'll remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa, sir, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.